Thank you, and thanks for all your efforts to advance cultural boycott of Israel in Italy. Back in 2009, I wrote that our South Africa moment was closer. Now, I think it is much closer than ever because the BDS movement is beginning to affect policy change towards isolating Israel's 77-year-old regime of settler colonialism and apartheid like never before. Israeli Prime Minister Netanyahu actually admitted as much. He said we should make Israel a super Sparta. Arguably, this is the strongest admission to date of Israel's unprecedented global isolation, which is also affecting its economy. Over 130 leading Israeli economists already in 2024 warned that Israel was entering a spiral of collapse. Israel's credit rating is near junk levels, according to Moody's, and the chairman of the Israel Export Institute has admitted that, quote, BDS and boycotts have changed Israel's global trade landscape, end of quote. But what about the ceasefire, one may ask? Echoing almost the entirety of the Palestinian people, the BDS movement has welcomed the ceasefire with immense relief. We realize, however, that this is only the first step to end the genocide against 2.3 million Palestinians in the illegally occupied Gaza Strip. Without massive pressure, this will constitute a continuation of a less visible form of genocide that Israel and the US hope will provoke less regional and global outrage, boycotts, and sanctions. Israel's induced famine in Gaza, the repercussions of the annihilation of Gaza will not end with the ceasefire. Neither will Israel's illegal military occupation, apartheid, denial of refugee rights. Only serious accountability and lawful sanctions can force the US-Israeli genocidal axis to respect the ceasefire and eventually end the siege of Gaza. Solidarity is therefore more needed than ever, and solidarity begins with ending complicity and serious accountability. Both are moral and legal obligations. Blaming the patent depravity and unspeakable criminality of Israel's genocide on Netanyahu and his fascist government alone would betray either selective amnesia or a prejudiced reading of the current reality. According to a recent Israeli public opinion poll, 82% of Jewish Israelis support the ethnic cleansing of all Palestinians from Gaza, and 56% support even the forced expulsion of Palestinian citizens of present-day Israel. About 50% support the full extermination of Palestinians in Gaza. According to Orly Noy, the chairwoman of B'Tselem, Israel's largest human rights organization, quote, Israel is unleashing a Holocaust in Gaza, and it cannot be dismissed as the will of the country's current fascist leaders alone, end of quote. Noy calls for what she calls denazification process in Israeli society. Israel, like settler colonies in the Americas and Australia, has long desired to exterminate the indigenous people of Palestine if it felt it could get away with it. It has for decades committed what Israeli historian Ilan Pappé calls incremental genocide. A recent error by Israel's censors has accidentally revealed secret documents exposing David Ben-Gurion's decision to wipe out Palestinian villages during the 1948 Nakba. So when Israeli leaders called for ethnically cleansing Gaza to re-establish colonial settlements there, they are honestly representing the founding principles of Zionism and Zionist settler colonialism. A growing human rights international consensus now recognizes Israel's unspeakable crimes against 2.3 million Palestinians in Gaza as a live-streamed genocide, with the United Nations Independent Commission of Inquiry and the International Association of Genocide Scholars being the latest. When a UN-backed body finally declared that famine had struck hundreds of thousands of Palestinians in Gaza, it affirmed what many human rights organizations and scholars had known for months. Israel's weaponized starvation of Palestinians is the latest, most depraved phase of its genocide. In parallel, and in full partnership with the colonial West, led by the US, Israel is destroying with impunity the pillars of international law and bringing the world much closer to a might makes right era. At the core of Israel's total impunity lies the complicity of states, corporations, and institutions, including cultural institutions, with Israel's regime of oppression. And it is precisely this complicity that the global Palestine solidarity movement, led by BDS, seeks to disrupt and to sever. As dozens of UN human rights experts have affirmed, in order for states to comply with their legal obligations triggered by the International Court of Justice's rulings, they must impose a comprehensive military embargo on Israel, as well as cancel or suspend economic relationships, trade agreements, and academic relations with Israel, among others, that may contribute to Israel's unlawful presence and apartheid regime in the occupied Palestinian territory. Some states are complying with their duties. Colombia, Turkey, and other global South states are imposing energy, trade, or military embargoes on Israel. In the West, Spain, Slovenia, Scotland, among others, now support sweeping sanctions. The global majority today realizes that Israel's regime of oppression is a model for much of the world's authoritarian rulers. It is a partner of fascist parties in the West, including in Italy, most of whom are anti-Semitic to the core, and it is a friend of far-right regimes globally. Israel sells its military security technologies and colonial doctrines as battle-tested, of course tested on the bodies of Palestinians, Lebanese, Syrians, and other Arabs. From the export of weaponized spyware technologies and disinformation and election rigging services as a diplomacy tool, Israel has for many years been a culprit in not just illegal surveillance and influence in the West, but also war crimes perpetrated by dictatorships around the world. Facing Israel's Western-enabled genocide and exercising our moral agency, we in the BDS movement have learned to persistently channel our grief and rage into principled and strategic energy to end Israel's genocide, dismantle its underlying regime of settler colonialism and apartheid, and, very importantly, hold the perpetrators and their accomplices to account. We shall never forget and we shall never forgive the perpetrators as well as the enablers of this genocide. Palestinians have no illusions, though, that justice will shine on us from the ICJ in The Hague or the United Nations in New York. We have international law and the ethical high ground on our side as an indigenous people resisting a depraved genocidal system of oppression to achieve our rights. Ethics and the law are necessary in any liberation struggle, but they're never sufficient. To resist and dismantle a system of oppression, the oppressed invariably need power as well. People power, effective solidarity power, grassroots power, intersectional coalition power, media power, cultural power, among other forms. So when the Palestinian consensus calls for BDS worldwide, including against Israel's complicit academic, cultural, and sports institutions, we're not begging the world for charity. We're calling for meaningful solidarity. But before both, we're demanding an end to complicity, to do no harm. As the struggle that abolished apartheid in South Africa has shown, ending state, corporate, and institutional complicity in Israel's regime of oppression, especially through the nonviolent tactics of BDS, is the most effective form of solidarity. So what's BDS? Briefly, Launched in 2005, the nonviolent BDS movement is led by the largest coalition in Palestinian civil society. It's inspired by the South African anti-apartheid struggle and the US civil rights movement, and it's rooted in a century of Palestinian popular resistance. It aims at ending Israel's occupation and apartheid, as well as upholding the right of Palestinian refugees to return and receive reparations. Anchored in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, the BDS movement categorically opposes all forms of racism and discrimination, including anti-Palestinian racism, anti-Muslim, anti-Jewish, anti-Black racism, and so on. BDS targets complicity, not identity. There is nothing Jewish about Israel's illegal occupation, ethnic cleansing, settler colonialism, apartheid, or genocide. Therefore, there's nothing anti-Jewish about striving to end these structures of oppression, especially through BDS. Over the last 2 decades, the BDS movement has built a massive network supported by trade unions, farmers' coalitions, women's groups, racial, social, gender, climate justice movements, together representing tens of millions worldwide. The movement's impact has grown exponentially. BDS, for example, has played a significant role in the divestment of giant sovereign funds in Norway, Luxembourg, the Netherlands, New Zealand, and elsewhere from complicit companies and banks. Norway's pension fund, the world's largest, has divested its entire $500 million worth of Israel bonds, as have the US-based United Methodist Church and Presbyterian Church. BDS has made large multinationals such as Veolia, Orange, G4S, Pillsbury, among others, end complicity in Israel's crimes. Co-op, a supermarket in the UK and in parts of Italy, have joined the boycott of Israeli products, and tens of city councils, especially in Europe, have adopted ethical procurement and investment guidelines to exclude companies implicated in Israel's crimes. In the last year or so alone, there have been deeply inspiring, meaningful BDS measures led by trade unions globally. The Italian trade union movement is particularly such an inspiring force in this regard. They have led national strikes against the genocide, setting a global precedent. The national strikes in Italy were the first against the genocide worldwide. Israel's economy is experiencing serious problems with a brain drain, a nosediving tech industry. It's what we call a shutdown nation. Israel has recently ranked dead last among 50 countries in the recently released Nations Brand Index. Tens of universities, mostly in Europe, Latin America, and South Africa, have cut academic ties with Israel's deeply complicit academic institutions. And universities in the US have divested from companies enabling Israel's crimes. In the cultural domain, as many of you know, almost 700 Dutch and Belgian cultural institutions, including the massive International Documentary Film Festival Amsterdam, IDFA, the largest in the world, have most recently endorsed the cultural boycott of Israel. More than 5,000 film workers, mostly from Hollywood, have signed a pledge to boycott Israel's complicit film industry. Tens of thousands of cultural figures, including writers, musicians, filmmakers, visual artists, and a rapidly growing number of arts organizations, unions, and associations have publicly endorsed the cultural boycott. Under pressure from artists and human rights defenders, many major music, literary, and arts festivals around the world are dropping corporate sponsors that are complicit in Israel's crimes, or have ended partnerships with Israel and its lobby groups and complicit institutions. Complicit Israeli film festivals have been cancelled. Institutions that have censored artists standing in solidarity with Palestinians have faced widespread boycotts. The Israeli pavilion at the last Venice Architecture Biennale, as you know, was cancelled. Globally, hundreds and hundreds of institutions are joining the cultural boycott of Israel. But some might say, we understand BDS against corporations, even states, but why culture? Isn't culture above politics? I know none in this room believes that, but we hear that still quite often. Well, Israel's ongoing genocide, according to UN human rights experts, has included domicide, herbicide, scholasticide, medicide, ecocide, and cultural genocide, as they called it. Israel has used culture to artwash its genocide, as well as its underlying regime of settler colonial apartheid. One of the main objectives of ACBI, of the academic and cultural boycott of Israel, is exposing the deep complicity of Israel's academic and cultural institutions in Israel's regime of oppression, thus revealing the true brand of Israel. Talk about brands, the Israeli government launched its so-called Brand Israel campaign in 2005, arguably in response to the 2004 PACBI call and the initial traction that the PACBI call had gained in the UK and elsewhere. At the launch of this branding campaign, which has desperately tried to improve Israel's image abroad, a senior Israeli government official said, quote, "We're seeing culture as a hasbara, or propaganda, tool of the first rank." And he said, "I do not differentiate between hasbara and culture," end of quote. Later, after Israel's massacre in Gaza in 2009, another top Israeli foreign ministry official told the New York Times, quote, "We will send well-known novelists and writers overseas, theater companies, exhibits. This way, you show Israel's prettier face," end of quote. A little-known component of the Israeli government's Brand Israel effort is a contract that actually obliges Israeli artists and writers as service providers who receive state funding to conform to and indeed promote Israel's policies. This contract effectively buys the artists and writers and academics' consciences, making a mockery of the freedom of expression mantra. Israeli cultural institutions claim that the boycott infringes upon their freedom and ignores that they are the most liberal part of Israeli society opposed to the occupation. This argument, aside from being quite disingenuous and baseless, is in fact intended to deflect attention from three basic facts. First, the boycott was called for because Israel was oppressing and now exterminating Palestinians, denying us all rights, including cultural rights. Second, the Palestinian academic and cultural boycott of Israel targets institutions, not individuals. And third, those institutions, Israeli institutions, far from being more progressive than the Israeli public, are a main pillar of the Israeli structure of colonial and apartheid oppression. Israeli artists, like the rest of Israeli society, have overwhelmingly turned genocidal. BDS fundamentally calls on all people of conscience and their institutions to fulfill their profound moral obligation to desist, to stop complicity in Israel's system of oppression against Palestinians. Artists and other cultural figures are no exception. They have the same moral duty to do no harm. So what is the BDS movement calling for right now as a matter of priority? One, challenging and peacefully disrupting complicity of states, corporations, and institutions, pushing the state for lawful sanctions against Israel, particularly a comprehensive military and energy embargo, as well as expelling Israel from the UN. Two, escalating strategic boycott and divestment campaigns, including in the cultural sector. Three, convincing businesses, cultural, academic, and other organizations, as well as trade unions, to declare themselves apartheid-free zones. Four, organizing strategic intersectional campaigns to pressure investment funds, pension funds, institutions, city councils, theaters, churches, universities to adopt ethical procurement and ethical investment guidelines that exclude companies implicated in grave human rights violations anywhere in the world. Sudan, Myanmar, Congo, no matter where. These guidelines can then be applied to divest from Israel bonds and companies involved in Israel's atrocities. 5, and last, support legal and human rights groups' initiatives for investigating and prosecuting Israelis and others who have been involved in international crimes against Palestinians. To conclude, for a century, the Palestinian people has been resisting oppression without giving up. We do not have the luxury of giving up or falling into genocide fatigue. We insist on our full menu of rights, as Archbishop Desmond Tutu once put it. We strive to thrive in our homeland in freedom, justice, equality, and unmitigated dignity. For our children, for our women and men, for humanity at large, do not fall into complacency until you have ended Italy's complicity in Israel's crimes. That would be the most precious contribution to our struggle for liberation, for realizing our South Africa moment. Thank you.